Welcome everybody for the virtual launch of our new Boiler House Press edition of Gertrude Trevelyan's wonderful 1937 novel, 2,000 Million Manpower. I'll start with a little talk about Trevelyan and her life and the book, and then Rachel Hore, who very graciously agreed to provide the introduction to the book, will give a short reading, and we'll have a little question and answer. And if you have any questions about the book or about Trevelyan, we'd be happy to entertain them. Boiler House Press intends to be bringing out a number of Trevelyan's books in the next 2 years. So we're certainly excited to see interest in this amazingly, as I was just telling Rachel, I've been following neglected books and neglected authors. It's been a passion of mine for decades. And this is the most extreme example of essentially high talent and utter neglect after her death that I've ever come across in a writer. So it's a real honor to be able to help bring her back to the reading public. And let me now just go into my presentation here. Okay, is everybody seeing that? So Gertrude, this talk would answer two questions. Who was Gertrude Trevelyan? And also, where did that strange title come from? And let me address the second question first. I was mystified for a long time. I first read this book about 3 years ago. And I was mystified like anybody else seeing it. It's not exactly something that rolls off the tongue. And then I was searching for where it might have come from. And I found this exact quote from this book. It was actually a 10-volume encyclopedia set called The Universal History of the World, issued in the early 30s in the UK. And this is from an article called The World Today, where you see there the phrase appears in the context of contrasting essentially the productivity of two countries. So China on the one hand having a large population but being very manually oriented, and the United States where the writer says that there's something like 25 million working males and something like 2,000 million manpower in machinery. And I think that's an important clue, because we will see in this book, this is a real theme of this book, is essentially the dehumanizing effect of mechanization and progress. And that's certainly the case, is that this is a shot from Charlie Chaplin's famous movie, Modern Times, the automation. And we see this, in fact, this is a quote late in the book where it talks about men becoming a cog in the circumference of countless interlocking wheels, all the wheels turning and grinding, gathering speed, one vast, intricate machine speeding up quicker and quicker, running on manpower, running with loudening roar and grind through space to nothing. What had man come to? It was a pity that man had come to that. So let's talk now about G.E. Trevelyan, Gertrude Trevelyan. She published as G.E., and I somewhat unilaterally and perhaps unduly took the choice that we would credit her as Gertrude. Of course, she followed the practice of a lot of female authors of that time, where essentially the work was diminished if it was known to be by a woman writer in some cases. She adopted G.E. Trevelyan. That's how she published all of her books. So perhaps she wouldn't appreciate being credited as Gertrude, but I think it's important that everyone know who this woman was. She was born in Bath in 1903, the daughter of a fairly moneyed family, comfortable but not essentially high wealth, and a very quiet family. Her father essentially was a man of means. So his main occupations were raising a garden and hunting and being a member of numerous fraternal organizations. She went to Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford, one of the few women colleges at the time, and this in fact became the subject of her second novel, Hot House. And that's where she really came to fame, because she competed in an annual prize called the Newdigate Prize, which is a competition for a poem of 300 lines on a set topic for undergraduates. And she won, and she was the first woman to win the Newdigate Prize. And this was blasted all over the world. It was such a novelty that I found newspaper articles referring to this from as far as Australia, Canada, and throughout the US, as well as throughout England. After she graduated, she moved to London. She lived in several women's hotels, and then finally, around 1931 or so, she took a flat in a nice part of Notting Hill, Kensington, and that's where she sat. She lived for the rest of her life. And in some ways, I like to say that she's an example of the untruth of Virginia Woolf saying about that all a woman needs is a room of her own and talent and 500 pounds a year, because Trevelyan had certainly the 500 pounds a year to pay for a room of her own. She had the talent, but the cautionary tale out of this life is that having talent and being able to focus on that work doesn't guarantee that you get remembered. And that's kind of been one of my passions for years, is the importance of looking beyond the writers we remember, because the ones who don't get remembered, it's not necessarily because they're bad. It's very often just poor luck, like Trevelyan. Her first novel got a lot of attention. It was called Appius in Virginia. Quite a strange book, which is about a spinster who buys a baby orangutan to perform an experiment. She takes a house in the country, very isolated, and she proceeds to try to raise this animal as a human being, treating it like a boy. So forcing it to eat with utensils, trying to actually teach it to read. It's actually disastrously bad experiments that doesn't come out of call at all, as you might expect. But how she treats this is quite remarkable. Now, not everybody liked that. So James Agate, who was one of the leading critics of the time, he dismissed it as what he called pretentious, puling twaddle, which is a fairly harsh way of describing any book. But fortunately, a few reviewers were able to recognize it, most notably Gerald Gould in the Observer, who called it a remarkable, original and powerful novel. She followed a year later with Hot House, which was based on her time at Oxford. This was about a very impressionable young undergraduate who takes part of and becomes obsessed with an instructor and goes to essentially a bad end. The year after that, she published an amazing book called As It Was in the Beginning, which undertakes a very interesting narrative device, which is, this is about a fairly idle, wealthy, but not particularly noble woman who is dying of a stroke in a care home. And the narrative actually follows two threads in parallel. So we have the chronological thread, which takes her as she's going through the experience up to the time of her death. But in parallel with that, her thoughts go back through her life so that essentially at the same time she's dying, she's remembering being born again. So interspersing these two narratives is really an amazing technical feat, I think. The year after that, she published what I think is her weakest book, A War Without a Hero, which is about an idle woman who divorces and goes to stay with a fishing family on one of the Channel Islands, and sort of becomes consumed with what you might call an unhealthy obsession about one of their sons. And this was not a well-received book at all. This is from a review in the Bystander by A.J. McDonnell. He called it a book that makes a reporter want to go out and shoot himself. And then we come, 2 years later, we come to this book that we're talking about today, 2000 Million Manpower. One of the reasons it took her a little bit longer is because it is so much based on the use of current history, particularly newspaper headlines and articles. She incorporates these into the text of the story. And this is from one of the very few letters that I've been able to locate by Trevelyan, where she talks about the time involved in preparing it. She says it involved a good deal of reading in the newspapers of the last 15 years. I've tried to show the problems of the average individual played upon by the various movements and events driving those years. And that's certainly what's the case. This is also a book that's very much embedded into the consumerist economy that was going on. So this couple that it follows, Catherine and Robert, they become very much, particularly Catherine, into the material goods and having everything associated with a nice, comfortable middle-class lifestyle. So they get a car, they get a house, they have vacuum cleaners, refrigerator, heated drying rack, radio, cocktail bar, all sorts of these accoutrements of the comfortable, ideal middle-class lifestyle. The year after this book, she actually published 2 books. So she was phenomenally productive, and not just phenomenally productive, because there are a lot of prolific writers in this period, but both prolific and pushing stylistic bounds. And this is the next book we're going to be bringing out from Trevelyan in the Recovered Books series, William's Wife. William's Wife is a fascinating story. It's about a woman who marries a grocer, and he's an extremely miserly man. And essentially his psychological domination of her is so powerful in its effect that after he dies, she essentially adopts that stinginess to the point that she goes through a series of, she essentially downsizes to poorer and poorer and humbler and smaller living places. And towards the end of the book, she actually starts buying her meat from the Cat's Meats man in the market because it's cheaper than the meat that's sold to human beings. And actually, in the very end, she's fishing food out of the gutter. So it's just remarkable. I don't know of anybody writing in that time who focused on somebody. Essentially, she becomes what we would call a bag lady today. The same year, she published her most experimental book called Theme with Variations. The variations are the fact that this book is actually 3 stories running in parallel, and it's about a working class man who has an injury and becomes wrapped up in a conspiracy, a political assassination conspiracy, a very talented and bright young woman who essentially becomes the prisoner of her family because of extreme codependency, if you will. And then finally, a very sweet but somewhat dull housewife who finds herself isolated in the suburbs as her husband abandons her, and she becomes essentially unable to integrate in society in any way. And throughout all of these, the common theme is essentially entrapment. So you see these characters throughout the book telling themselves some form of, I ought to do something about it. I've got to get out and do something, and essentially finding themselves unable to do that. because of psychological constraints or economic or social constraints. And then finally, her last book in 1939, Trance by Appointment, an interesting book. We will be bringing this out in the series as well. This is about a psychic, a working class woman who has psychic powers. And once those are discovered, how she essentially is turned into a machine for generating money, and how it degrades her as a person over the course of time. And we might have seen even more remarkable books from Trevelyan had not her flat been bombed on the night of the 11th of October in 1940. She sustained severe injuries. Her flat was destroyed, and she was taken to her parents' home in Bath. And that's where she died in March of 1941. And effectively at that point, she disappeared, sort of like an eclipse. And it's only now, many years later, that we're starting to bring her books back. I worked with Lightning Books and their Scott Pack's Abandoned Bookshop a series, and we were able to bring out her first novel, Appius in Virginia, which was published about 2 years ago, in fact. And now, of course, we're bringing out 2,000 Million Manpower. And as I mentioned, we're going to be bringing out 3 more books by Trevelyan, William's Wife in November of next year, as it was in the beginning, the May after that, and then finally Trance by Appointment in about 2 years from now. And I'm hoping that this will start a wave of recognizing this really remarkable writer. And so any help we can get in bringing back and paying attention to this work, because I don't think I'm alone. And I'll have to turn over to Rachel, but one of the frustrations with dealing with Trevelyan is her books are so exceptionally rare. I was able to locate this here. This is a copy of the original edition of 2,000 Million Manpower. You will not find this book for sale from any used dealer. Her books are so extraordinarily rare. And literally, there are, in some cases, some of her titles are only available at the National Registry libraries, like the British Library and the National Library of Scotland. So when we say she's disappeared, this isn't sort of like mildly unknown. This is completely vanished. She's not mentioned in any literary history of the period. There's just nothing about her. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Rachel, who will read us a passage from the book, and then we'll have a little discussion.
Thank you, Brad. I'm in deep admiration of all the work that you must have done to uncover all the facts about this splendid author. You must have had some real digging around to do in copyright libraries and so forth. I must ask you all about it at another stage. Well, I was asked to write the introduction to this novel, and I came to it thinking, you know, it was a rather extraordinary title. I couldn't actually gauge anything at all from the title, but I've ended up being incredibly admiring of the very clever, tricksy effect that the author has used by using headlines and extracts from newsreels and so forth in the book, as Brad has explained. But at heart, this is also a traditional novel in the sense that it's the story of a marriage against the background of this very distinctive period, the 20s and 30s, the interbellum period. And Robert and Kath come together. They're an idea. They're a couple with very high political ideals, but they're from a quite not impoverished, but say very frugal financial backgrounds. Kath is a teacher in a council school, and Robert is an industrial chemist working for a cosmetics company and inventing new products for them. They have very little spare money, but they do have quite socialist ideals. And before they married and before real life catches up with them, they have high hopes for life. But there comes a point where the depression kicks in, and Robert loses his job as the company he works for goes downhill. And he has a very terrible time trying to find another job. Kath at the same time is trying to find a job, though being a teacher and being married, in those days you weren't, you were rather barred from many jobs, including teaching. So we come to this point here where Kath has managed to find a job in a very down at heel school that has turned a blind eye to the fact that she's married. So Kath was earning, Kath was keeping them. Kath was out at 8 and back at 6, doing the work at the flat. The thought of it drove Robert out early, out when she was out, and sent him tramping the streets farther and more at random. He took to applying for labourers' jobs, though he knew they went to men from the labour exchanges. He stood in queues for hours for jobs he knew he wouldn't get, and tramped along streets of small shops with his eyes dragging the windows for wanted cards, apply within. He knew he had to get a job because of Kath. Kath couldn't go on. He couldn't go on letting Kath. He plodded along with his eyes on the windows, haircut and small tailors, apprentice wanted, smart lad to learn. He knew there was a job somewhere and he had to find it. He turned a corner and came face to face across the street with a slab of house-high hoardings. Bovo for bonny bairns, and a grinning crane top in a gap between roofs. He knew suddenly with certainty that he would never get a job. He stopped short and read it over. Bovo for bonny bairns. It meant nothing to him, and the crane meant nothing. And it meant nothing that a dingy house or two had been pulled down and hoardings were up house high along the site. But when he had first seen the 5-foot blue letters on the red ground and the slanting crane head and a yard or so of tiles on the next roof, he had known he would never get a job. He jerked away from the corner, across the road from the hoarding, and went on, shoulders up and head down. He knew there was a job somewhere, and he meant to get it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I asked for that passage in part because I think it really conveys how powerful this transformation of, going from a settled life and a secure salary and a place out in the suburbs to unemployment and the daily grind and the dehumanizing effect of having to apply for work where there was none. And I just think it's remarkable because I think there are so few books from that period, even though it was such a profound thing going on with the Depression and at the time, it was so rarely, really addressed by fiction writers in that period. Really, Orwell was dealt with it more than anyone.
In The Road to Wigan Pier,
absolutely.
Particularly, yes.
So, Rachel, when we contacted you about writing the introduction, of course, you knew nothing about Trevelyan, so you did agree to read through this completely unknown manuscript almost. So, what were your first reactions as you were going through the book?
It took me some time, several readings, in fact, to actually get into what it was about in the first few pages, because there was a certain amount of the dramatization of the newsreels and so on, and then gradually, rather in a rather filmic way, we gradually came into focus on Robert, this lone figure who lived in a lodgings in somebody's house, and he was spending all his spare time trying to work out an extraordinary formula that would explain the meaning of time, which apparently was a real obsession in the 1930s. And there he was, this very lonely individual. And then again, we see Kath from in the same way, and we gauge that they're very gradually going to get together. And it was, I have to say, the evocations of the characters that gripped me very quickly after that.
Well, I think one of the things I found interesting when I read the book was how well Trevelyan seemed to understand the practical challenges facing these characters. So there's a passage where, you know, they're starting to feel romantically attracted to each other, sexually attracted to each other, but they're both living in lodging houses, neither one of which can, you know, allow someone of the opposite sex to come in. So they're literally walking through the streets trying to figure out, is there a shadowy place where we can go neck and kind of quietly make out for a little bit?
It should be made clear that this book is actually very blackly funny, isn't it? Sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm.
There's many of these sort of situations that they deal with, and then you know, the depiction of, for example, Robert's workplace, and the fact it's out in a quite ugly area on the edges of the city, and just the tedious aspects of working there, and the little office, you know, the way it is in any office, that you have the little personality chafings that go on.
Yes, it's very well observed, isn't it?
Yeah, and remarkable because
where Trevelyan got this experience to write about it, whether it was from her own reading or whether it's from observing people she knew. Because again, as you so described so well, you know, you get the sense of her being a very lonely figure, actually, but maybe it's because all those kind of notebooks, diaries, letters, which a gregarious social person might usually leave behind them, perhaps they all got destroyed with the bomb. So we don't know who she was mixing with and talking to.
Well, she didn't review. She didn't have much of a social circle. The only really strong acquaintance that I can find was she dedicated her first book, Appius Virginia, to, it just says, to PLQ, and I was able to find out that PLQ stood for a French woman named Pauline Lequarge, I think was her name. She was like the daughter of a French ambassador who settled in England, and she gave private French lessons. Then she actually married the grandfather of Max Hastings, whose name escapes me. But was a rather well-known man, and Hastings and his family hated her, it turns out. But and because I was able to find out that she and Trevelyan were essentially staying at the same lodging, the Woman's Hotel, when she in the around 1930 or so. Other than that, you know, no one. She didn't know any of the characters in the literary world of the 1930s, because I've looked through, you know, letters and memoirs from all the people that you would expect one would know if you were a literary figure in London at that time, and she's never mentioned by any of them.
Mm-hmm. I think we can gauge that she had an incredibly original mind, didn't she?
Absolutely.
I mean, the breadth of subject matter and the ways of approaching the different areas of inquiry in her books. you couldn't say that they formed a genre or anything. That it's quite an extraordinary body of work, really. I don't know who you would compare her with. Have you had any thoughts about that, or who her influences were, apart from?
No, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I'm so fascinated with Trevelyan is that every book she wrote was completely different, stylistically different, subject matter. I mean, she in William's Wife, which is the next one we're going to bring out. I mean, it's writing about a class of people that she would have probably had no contact with other than just observing them. And I do kind of picture her spending days riding around on buses and walking around and taking notes and just going through this phenomenal these acts of observation and kind of distilling this sense of other people, because it is remarkable how thoroughly she can immerse herself in the consciousness of characters from quite different backgrounds than her own.
Right at the beginning of your talk, you showed a photograph of her standing with a group of men. What was that about? I mean, to me, it felt
well,
like
she wrote
thing.
a short essay called Garden Cities. It was in an anthology published in 1933, I believe, called Red Rags: Essays of Hate from Oxford. And that was a photograph of the contributors to that anthology. And it's striking that she's the only woman in the group.
Yes, I thought, yes.
Yeah. And so that photo was published in the Bystander in a little news piece about the release of the anthology. So that was like the book launch ceremony or party for Red Rags. Yeah, and actually it was edited by what's his name? Cummins, who was eventually married another much forgotten writer who's been rediscovered, Barbara Cummins.
Yes, I've read her, yes.
So
we've got a question. We've got a question under the chat.
Yes.
Should we put the question? It all sounds so modern, but equally so 70s.
Well, it's a very contemporary. I mean, the problems that are faced by Robert and Catherine are in some ways very contemporary, in the sense that they are both, they're a working couple and they're trying to figure out how to get the money to buy a house, and the sorts of fitting up of a middle class lifestyle that we all
like
do.
Margaret Drabble, perhaps. Margaret Drabble is like The Waterfall.
Yeah, it's true. Actually, Drabble is a good comparison, because she was capable, or still is capable, of writing about a wide variety of people.
Yes, and The Radiant Way, looking at very much the background of the times as well. As well as the people with it, and the Ice Age as well.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, that's one of the other things, one of the reasons I wanted to bring this book out first of the various Trevelyan books we're considering or planning to bring out, because in some ways it's a wonderful snapshot of really about 15 years of English social history. You really get a sense of daily life and daily concerns of people living in London, and juxtaposed into the context of what was going on historically and technologically, and all sorts of other aspects of life.
And a shrewd political eye, I would say.
Yeah. Although what's interesting is the two letters I've been able to locate from Trevelyan, she actually sounds a little bit conservative-ish. She wasn't happy about, in fact, the publication of this book was postponed slightly because of the abdication. And she was definitely a monarchist, I would say, at heart. She wasn't for the overthrow, and she actually was looking forward to essentially the restoration of the status quo by this this man who was going to upset everything by
Mm.
breaking the royalty traditions of marrying an American, a divorcee, and all that sort of thing. So even though she takes quite a radical tone in a lot of her books, particularly Theme with Variations is definitely about, like this book, it's very much about the fact that there is a dehumanizing nature to modern society. But I would suspect that she was probably a Tory at heart.
Oh, that's an interesting
It's
observation.
really hard to tell because we have
Yes,
so little left about her. My
Yeah.
only hope is that as this book, as her work becomes better known, people will be able to find material in archives that hasn't been mined yet, because
Yeah.
in my survey so far, I've been able to produce essentially nothing. I mean, a couple of letters because she wrote to a woman in the United States who was a fan. Other than that, yeah, there's very little trace of her. So it's hard to read too much without venturing into fantasy, I guess.
Yes. Did her parents survive her?
Her parents did survive her, but only by a few years. So they both lived till after the war, and then they died within, I think her father died and then her mother, and before 1950, I think they were both dead. And all three of them are buried together. Actually, she had an infant brother who died soon after birth. All four of them are buried in a cemetery up the road from her parents' house in Bath.
Right. And I was wondering whether they might have made some attempt to preserve her legacy.
There's nothing I can have found. The only thing that sounds promising, but so far hasn't produced results, is she did leave part of her estate to a woman who was in fact the solicitor for the Society of Authors for a number of years, the general counsel. But I've contacted the Society of Authors and they don't have any trace of Trevelyan other than the fact that she was a member.
Yeah, yeah. Someone's asking, are there similarities with Patrick Hamilton's works? Do you think?
I think certainly in the the aspects of lodging house life in London, that of course was Hamilton's forte. And I think also some other aspects of the kinds of situations that characters can get themselves into, the sense of being trapped. Certainly Hamilton deals with people who are finding themselves at dead ends.
Yep.
And the passage that you read from Robert's experience, he certainly had the sense that he was at his own dead end, in the absence of being able to find any meaningful work. So it's certainly like Hamilton. It's rich from an atmospheric standpoint. You can picture where these people are. You can sense what the situations are like, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, are there other questions from folks who are taking part today? I know we have a small group, but I'm a strong believer that a small band of evangelists has changed the world before, so we can do it this time.
Will this events be available after?
Yes, it will. Yes, it's being recorded, and this will be posted on YouTube. So if people want to watch it afterwards, and obviously, this is a book. We're not a big press. We don't have a lot of marketing clout, and so I think this is a book, and I think Trevelyan, the word will get out by word of mouth to start with, but I am confident that over the course of time, in the next 5 years, I think we're going to find that Trevelyan comes back really in a huge way as just a gaping hole in our literary history, particularly of a period, considering how deeply the fiction of the 1920s and 30s has been studied, that her work has been completely missed is just astonishing.
What else is the imprints coming up with in the immediate future?
Thank you for feeding me that line. Yes, well, we have a number of things coming out. I'm very happy to say we have a publishing plan for at least the next 2 years in place, and we're starting to lay the framework for 2025. So in May of 23, we will be publishing 3 titles. The first, well, in no particular order, we have a novel called Quarry, which is from an English writer named Jane White. This was published in 1967. It's really a strange novel. In fact, I just literally got the introduction and afterword all finished up in the last week. It's about 3 boys who hold another young boy captive in a quarry and ultimately kill him.
But you've given away the ending there.
Yeah, spoiler there, but it's not a suspense novel in any way. You kind of know what's going to happen very early on. It's been compared, when it came out, it was compared to Lord of the Flies, but it's sort of like, so it is both so bizarre and so normal at the same time that it's quite a striking book. And White she died of multiple sclerosis, I think in 1981. She wrote 6 books, and her work has again vanished. None of it's been in print since her death. We have a collection of poetry and prose by an American writer named Genevieve Taggart, who, Taggart is well documented in literary history. She's mentioned very often as one of the leading American novelist, modernist poets, and yet there's never been a collection of her work that was comprehensive over her career. So we're excited about that one. And then we have a German novel about a psychiatrist who's essentially trying to figure out how to practice his profession and uphold the Hippocratic Oath in the midst of the working under the Nazi regime. And that's called the Sanity Inspectors by Frederick Dyke. And in November of next year, we have William's Wife by Trevelyan. We also have an interesting novel. It's by an American woman, published in Britain only, about growing up on a ranch in rural Nevada, called No More Giants by Joaquina Ballard Howells. And then we have what I really think is, to me, one of the most human books I've ever read. It's called Time Stood Still, which is about an Austrian who was interned during World War I in England. And it was, in terms of concentration camps, it was a gentleman's concentration camp, so to speak. He was never abused or anything like that, but he conveys the psychological abuse that exists when you find that you're stuck in a place, you can't leave, there's nothing to do, and how that erodes one's personality over the course of time. Really remarkable book. And then in 24, we have several novels, we have a memoir, and then also we'll have 2 books by Trevelyan coming out. So, really the focus, we're not trying to pursue, the one thing I'll say about Recovered Books is we're not pursuing like a single genre or theme. We're really, the one common theme about all these books is that they've been out of print for a long time, and that they're of exceptional merit, in my opinion, at least.
Someone's asking, did you write Trevelyan's Wikipedia entry?
Yes, I did. These little ways, I've written a couple of scholarly papers about Trevelyan, so hopefully, eventually this stuff percolates out. And it's really, I'm not looking for credits out of this. If 10 years from now, her name is routinely being bandied about as one of the fine novelists of the 1930s, I'll be ecstatically happy.
I will too.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking part, and thank for everybody who has joined in on this. I hope it has gotten you excited about this strange but wonderful book called 2000 Million Manpower, and the author, Gertrude Trevelyan, who we will be bringing back into her rightful place in literary history, I hope, in the next few years.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.